Yeah. Brilliant.
Shall we begin? Okay, welcome to this roundtable entitled How to be Critical in and of the Present in World Politics. Before I introduce our speakers and talk about the format of this roundtable, I would like to say that we don't have microphones and that thing captures sounds really well. So I would ask you to be as quiet as possible, so your sound is not captured there. So, okay, so in this roundtable, we'll have Lara Selis from Federal University of PUC-Rio, Engin Isin from Queen Mary University, Lage from Federal University of Bahia, and Jef Huysmans from Queen Mary University. So the aim of this roundtable is to reflect on how international political sociology can engage with the present, which often, as we know, is turbulent, in the role of critique in this process. It assumes that problems of the present cannot be addressed through old approaches or familiar repertoires. I don't know why did I put this difficult word here, but instead requires new ways of engaging with the present and problems. We would like to encourage a more conversational format to this roundtable, so we will proceed in the following ways. We have 3 questions prepared. Each participant will respond briefly to each question, 5 minutes each. And after that, we'll open the floor to the audience. If the audience would like to also try to respond to the questions or to the responses of the participants, you are more than encouraged to do so. So we'll have around 30 minutes in total for each round of questions. So with that said, let's move on to the first question. We agree here that they will speak in this order, right? Lara, Engin, and Jef. The first question is, what do you consider to be the defining problems of the present, not as the single most important ones, but as some of the significant reference points through which the present is currently problematized?
Well, hi everyone, can you hear me? Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today and to have the opportunity to listen to me, Paula, and Jef. I must say that it is also a little bit intimidating. I am intimidated. It's on the table, maybe because of the topic. That's cool. But I will try my best to help me to stay right. I wrote down 2 points. So I will be reading from my notes at times. So to start, I think it is important to clarify that I'm approaching this and the other questions from a feminist standpoint. So when you ask me about the defining problems of the present, I can help to think about the operation of patriarchy. So this has been a key concern of feminist critique for a long time, or at least for Western feminist critique. So when we look to this literature, we can find a huge set of authors trying to understand not only how patriarchy has worked and past, but also how it keeps working, how it adapts, how it shows up in different or maybe similar ways over time. So if we take Gabo or Brown, for example, they both seems to agree that patriarchy has this ability to reinvent itself across time and context. So it has something like an adaptive nature to patriarchy. So for them, engagement with the present would probably involve the need to analyze how these patriarchal forces can promote different arrangements between actors, bias, different solidarities, discourse, and modes of exploitation. But on the other hand, if we consider a different set of authors, so for example, Susan Palucci, and those who mobilize the backlash narrative, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but with those authors, patriarchy appears more as a form of historical repetition that mobilize similar strategies over time to release gender equality. So it also seems to follow a kind of enduring logic. So each time women make a move or a step forward, we meet a reactive force emerges to push them back or to push we back. So with this in mind, one of the questions that comes to me when I look to the present is that if patriarchy shows up both in unique ways and through repeated patterns, how can we propose a feminist critique in a present that feels sometimes out of reach, but also already set? Both hard to grasp, but somehow over-determined. So just to give an example, I keep thinking in these incels, thread wives videos, you know what that? So, and when we look to these movements, we can see some ideas or messages or images that are quite familiar for us. So they usually use an discursive strategy that is based on the idea of blaming feminism for women's problems. So we hear ideas like female burnout, so emasculated men, fertility crisis, neglected children, or even the collapse of moral and family. These narratives are well known, and they have been serving the conservative imaginary for many years. But at the same time, we cannot deny that these thread wife scenes, for example, they seem to carry something new. So, for example, these women are performing traditional gender roles. In some way, they romanticize outdated lifestyles. They mimicking some kind of 50s aesthetic, but they are doing that in front of smartphones, and they are using technological device for doing that, and often they are profiting from the very autonomy they reject. So we have some kinds of contradictions here that seems to resist to easily translations or interpretations. So power, for example, cannot be read only in terms of discipline or by political turbulence. It seems to involve also a kind of psychic economy or psychic ability to play with our emotions, memory, attention, desires. So the challenges seems to be around the ability to create a productive engagement with this repetition without assuming it as a recurrence of the same. So this is important for us because in a way we have to stay critically engaged with this present, but without falling back on anxiety or frustration as our primary emotional response to this power dynamic. So these are some of the questions I want to raise right now, and I will maybe have the opportunity to develop them in the other questions.
Thank you. 5 minutes.
Thanks, Paula, and thanks everyone for participating in this panel. These are tough questions to address, even to begin in 5 minutes. But as Lara was reflecting on patriarchy and how the battle against patriarchy has changed its coloring in the last few years. I would just generalize that to various other struggles as well, and the intersectionality of these struggles. I feel that in the last 40, 45 years that I can consider myself as being politically engaged, one of the things that really strikes me as a significant development, significant transformation, is the various movements, various social movements reclaiming agency and voice. There was a book, People Without History, I forgot the author's name, but in the last 40, 45 years, it's almost as if people now have been written into history. What I mean by that is social movements about indigenous peoples, civil rights movement, feminist movement, queer international, various liberation movements. All these movements may appear as given to us now after 45 years, but in the longer scheme of things, they're actually the present. The present in the sense that in many ways they have just begun. Many of the struggles that sometimes coalesce together, sometimes come into conflict with one another. And then we often use various terminologies to describe them, the subjugated knowledges, restoring agency to peoples without history, and the emergence of global south, the post-colonial theory, decolonial theory. All this put together a tectonic shift, if I may use a geological metaphor. And this tectonic shift is being really significant in prying open some of the established protocols and conventions of domination, as a result of which people without history, with voice, now have entered the arena of power, questioning patriarchy, questioning racism, institutionalized, enduring racism, ethnicization, as well as binarism of gender roles. All these have been critiqued. Although I say that that's the present, the very recent present, I think, has brought a new shift to all of this. How do we define the boundaries of the very recent? I don't know. Perhaps 10 years, perhaps 5 years, perhaps even more recent, but change accelerated. And this change, not in the way in which we have anticipated, that is deepening of anti-colonial, anti-patriarchy struggles, but actually a counter force emerging against all these movements that have shaped in the last 15 years. Some sort of counter-insurgency we are experiencing, coming from neo-fascist, neo-imperialist, neo-colonialist mindsets and movements. They're well-organized, well-funded, technologically advanced. They have various means at their disposal, and their singular aim, although I have defined multiple movements, their singular aim to push back these multiple movements against women's liberation, against Black liberation, and so on. The list is long, but you know the kind of movements I'm talking about. So in the last 5 years, a bewildering speed, this counterinsurgency, well-funded and supported by states and corporations, and particularly technological corporations, have been pushing back against these movements. And now the very immediate present to me is how these movements, political problem for me in the immediate present, is that how these movements somewhat developed independently from another, although they coalesced and intersected with one another, how can they form new coalitions and alliances of the kind that we have not seen and experienced before to counter the counterinsurgency? That to me seems to be the political question that's emerging in the present.
Yeah, first of all, good afternoon again. Thanks to João, Jef, and also the nuclear team for the work, for making this possible. So it's also great to share this activity with everyone here. So I cannot speak without read in English or in Portuguese, but this is in English, so I'm gonna read. I want to approach this question, having also in mind the description we received for the roundtable that Paula just read, where it said that current problems are not solved by old approaches. They will require, I quote, new forms of interaction with the present. So I would emphasize here the play between the old and the new in this sentence, that it resonates somehow with the question itself when the letter asks about reference points through which the present is currently problematized. So in a certain sense, I would say that new interactions with the present require, among other things, the combination of new and so-called old approaches so that the new, but most fundamentally the old and persistent problems can be tackled. In the field, I take so the field of IPS as one not only defined, as one that is not defined by a specific approach or certain intellectual references, but rather as this heterogeneous site where the forces in between the international, the political, and the sociological can be grasped. So I'm gonna go into that here. That's why the defining problem here would be linked to what the IPS can offer. It cannot offer everything, right? So IPS can be such a productive site precisely because it makes evident how the problem of the international, or rather the international conceived as a problem, is such a difficult one to grasp despite its persistence. Often abandoned as a supposedly old spatial temporal problem in favor of allegedly new current ones, I would say, however, that the international is still a defining problem of the present. To put it differently, the international conceived as a problem is another name for a certain dimension of modernity, conceived as both the remedy and the poison of contemporary theorization and political struggles. And I will highlight three different interrelated angles in this regard. First, as we were talking earlier today, the boundary practices and the relationalities putting in motion the triple binding of citizenship, state, international, are still conditioning not only the political life of human beings, but also what counts as human in the first place. This triple binding is inseparable from peripheral subjectivities that it enacts, but that enact this triple binding itself. The second angle relates to the necessity of, but also the ontological and political obstacle to, the cultivation of an internationality of struggles. Here, if it's true that we can notice many examples of struggles related to class, gender, race, territory, climate change, as Engin was pointing out, that are internationally connected, we also note their difficulty in face of the ongoing force of that triple binding, state, citizenship, and international. So here, new issues meet old ones when we consider, for instance, questions of race and class in face of nationalisms and internationalisms of different sorts. Or when we consider what seems to be an inseparable combination between struggles for self-determination and either their dependence on some kind of state law or the culmination in a form of state, if only for a strategic reason. Finally, the third angle would be linked to how many new approaches critical to humanism, those in dialogue with biology, quantum physics, post-human studies, but also, and mainly, those related to critical race theory, indigenous studies, disability studies, and queer theories, they have been showing certain of the so-called old problems as profoundly entrenched in the so-called new ones. The persisting as well as mutating force of dichotomies such as nature-culture, backward advanced, irrational, rational, barbaric, civilized, inseparable as they are from the triple binding citizenship, state, and international, reminds us that if we have never been modern, we still live nonetheless, and experience modern problems. So these, do I have 1 minute?
You do have one.
Thank you.
Half a minute now.
These 3 remarks point not exactly to specific problems that would be defining of the present, although I said that the problem of the international would be a defining problem, but rather to certain ways in which we conceive or fail to conceive present problems and political struggles in the first place. Moreover, these remarks say nothing of international relations as a discipline, also because I think disciplinary demarcations, including their corresponding separation into subfields, are precisely what represent one of the most fundamental obstacles to conceptually and politically productive definition of current, not necessarily new problems. That said, however, I'm certainly not suggesting that the international conceived as a problem is sufficient for critical analysis in and of the present in world politics. I have highlighted here only because it is still striking to me how often in the field of IPS, but not only there, the persistence of problems related to the sociological and the political is as easily identified as the persistence of problems related to the international can be easily dismissed as anachronistic or already gone. So the problematization of the international is for sure insufficient, but it's also indispensable to certain theorizations and mainly political struggles nowadays.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to go on a limb here because the question was about what's the present. I have an answer. The present is complex. And that's the answer I'm going to try in 5 minutes to get across. And I think it differs from what I've heard so far as well. The reason why I'm saying complex is complexity refers to a way of thinking and engaging with what's going on in the present and understanding the present over a relatively longer term than just the last 4 years or 3 years, which is that a lot of it, that it means you don't start with central points, you don't try to recreate units, but importantly also, you don't think relations in terms of boundaries, borders, limits, and so on. And therefore, counter politics has to be rethought differently too. So there is a lot of investment happening at the moment. If you look in the problematization of the problems, whether they are political problems, right? The politics are constructed around the political spectacle. There's a lot of investment in restructuring politics as if it's a binary structure. You got the far right, you got the far left, and then you got the old liberals in the middle who are disappearing. The liberal order is in crisis. So there's a lot of element of reinstituting an old concept of the political spectacle which works with friends and enemies and drawing strict borders between them. But it turns out it doesn't work so well necessarily at it because a lot of work goes in it. But then, you know, you do policies and the global economy is decentralized, social movements become decentralized, they work in fractured ways. And so it doesn't work. So what if we actually accept that the present is complex in that sense? Complexity means you're not defined by the boundaries and the limits, but by the associations that happen internally within it, the multiplicities that take place. So it requires a rethinking of politics. And I think that comes to the idea that therefore the borders, boundaries thinking is in some way the leftovers that are still playing out. But the reason why it's so important is because the world, the present, is complex. It hasn't been for a while, and has been for a while in it. You can think similarly about things like the planetary and environmental case. How is the environment? I think Engin put up in the lecture in the beginning the 9 limits, right, of the Earth, the system. And we have reached, I can't remember, was it 7 we have reached? But it's again a limit thinking. There's not boundary thinking, but there's also a limit thinking. But you know, everybody knows that earthly life and process are very complex. They don't line up necessarily in these easy ways. There are all kinds of unintended effects. If you poke a bit here, then something will happen there. And there is a lot of illusions as well that we can control, like the geoengineering tries to do. Because we know the limits and we can control what we do. So the limit thinking seems to structure environmental work. But there's a lot of interesting thinking going on around environment as well, as a complex system that doesn't actually line up into a unity, which makes it then very difficult to think the present about when you do something, what's going to happen within it. So I think there are many examples why we could actually argue, which is like a non-statement. present is complex. What does that mean? Yeah, of course things are complex. Everything is complex. But I think complexity is a particular way, and it's not new. I mean, there has been a lot being invested in complexity systems from the 60s onwards and so on in thinking this through. I think if we want to actually answer the question that came in from the background text, so this is roundtable emerged, this was Foucault's What is the Enlightenment, that Engin pointed out, and I read that, is what's the difference of the present? You don't have to look at the last year or the last moment. I'm wondering if we can play around with these notions of complexity as meaning. We have to think in terms of multiplicity, heterogeneities that relate to one another, and you let go of politics and the social and human associations, thinking them as through the constitutions of borders, boundaries that clearly separate things and limits where the end is of what you. And then we can, of course, know when we reach real dramatic states and limits, for example, because when you've reached the limit of the earthly life, that's the end of the life. So there is an element, I think, where I would like to play around with the idea and see if we can have a conversation about it, what you guys think about thinking the present as what makes it different from yesterday is complexity. That's it, right?
Okay, exactly 5 minutes. So, okay, now we open the floor to the audience. Would somebody like to comment the responses of our panelists or propose another frame of reference that you think is more significant? Or something else?
Professor Jef, I think I need a little bit of clarification because what I understand from what you're saying is that the past is income. That's not what you mean.
Yes, in some way I do and I don't. It is about naming the present, right? To try to come and understand about the difference about the present. So that's a question about the present. It's how does it, what's different about the present compared to before? So is there something different to it? And Victor is doing a lot of work that actually there's a lot of continuity going on. So I try to name the difference through complexity and then invest something specific in it. And the reason why I actually invest in complexity at this element that you don't think in units, you don't recreate that we have nice units around identities or around the earth as one thing, but that we have a lot of that, and neither do we actually create clear lines between politics and society. It's very easy understandable. If you're different from me, right, clearly different, and then we can try to negotiate our difference. But what if we are already related in all kinds of ways in which there is not the line to separate you from me? So then I think that's what complexity is, and that I think requires in the social sciences have elements to think this through, the philosophy as well, but it's not a straightforward way. And the reason why I think this is the proof, or this is the element, why I think complexity is an issue, is that there is a lot of investment going on in redrawing borders and limits to think around these and restructure as if it's like politics, so human associations, struggles, you know, the nature of life on Earth only makes sense. We can only work with it if we draw borders, boundaries, or limits with it, because then we know that what exists and what its limit is. Or we know who I am, and we know who you are. And we know, you know, we can relate, we can interact with one another, rather than we are already mingled up because of God knows what else is going on in the other. So that's why I think complexity, yes, of course, in some way, you read back is what I think we can do it in the second element is you read back into history what it means. But I would, for this kind of roundtable, I would say, yes, the present is complex. And yesterday was not in that way.
Another follow-up question. More in the lines of a clarification as well. So the present is complex because we are fighting for and drawing and setting the boundaries, limits, and borders. And the past is not complex because the borders, boundaries, borders, limits are there. They have been gone.
I don't want to monopolize because it was an idea that people would come in the thing, right, in conversation. But I think the board boundary limits is the structuration of the modern international, but the modern and modernity as such, as a whole, you could say. That's the characterization of that one. Complexity breaks with this. So that's why, but there is a lot of temptation to always think in borders, boundaries, and so on. So if the present is complex, there was an element that this question is about how do we problematize the present, not that we already have solutions to the present, right? So if the problematization is complexity, so then how do we think, for example, our relations and human associations, or how we are entangled with other species and earthly processes without reifying certain, so there's humanity, there are certain kinds of animals, other animals, there are the plants and so on, that we actually have this in mind. That is the problem. And I don't think there are a lot of instruments to think that necessarily. So the investment into the present is to think that, not to reestablish more, because that's the work of the past that's present in present. So I think the problem of the present is to think the complexity that exists. And I think it shifts how we actually think and engage with whatever the problem is we are engaging with, whether it's social movements, whether it's environmental problems, whether it's struggles in society and so on, whether it's feminism and patriarchy and so on. So that's why I thought I'll go out on the limb and just say chooks. Complexity. I hope that makes a bit of.
I have a question already in mind. I'm thinking we're talking about critiquing in and of the present, but every critique and everything you said here, all of you, there's some reference to the past, there's some reference to the future. For instance, Lara was saying about patriarchy with something for like 200 years. And then we're talking about environment, which is like an issue because if you don't act now in the future, you're not here anymore. So where is the present and how do we think of the present?
And then you kind like to take up that question.
Oh, that's us. The second question, I'll try to answer.
Okay.
So I can give a spoiler.
And now, but later.
Any other question, or shall we proceed to the second one?
Okay. You want to? No, not answer the question. But go ahead.
No, I thought it was very interesting first round. But I wanted to engage a little bit with what Lara and Engin were saying and see if they're saying something similar or very different. So Lara is saying, well, there's all this backlash that we're experiencing regarding this movement, the any way of asserting masculinity in certain ways and resisting all the what was achieved, right? Movements. But also we were saying, well, we should not panic, if I understood well. So these things repeat themselves, but it's not like things are lost. But I like if you could say more. I was curious. If you could say more, how do you really engage with these backlashes, right? If the ways we organize, the way we conceive patriarchy, the way we deal with these new manifestations, which you said are very logical, they're actually firm a model of femininity that is old-fashioned, but at the same time is assertive. So it's someone might say empowered for these women. So
Yes.
So how do you counter that? Is it through more organization of social movements as the way you used to? Just go forward, right? Which is more or less what Engin, I think, was saying. So there's a backlash, but this is historically, this is a backlash that we've seen before, so we just need more alliances, right? We need how to do alliances in this new context. So is it a matter of alliances, or is the modes of organization different, or can we not counter these very fragmented oppositions to feminism, to counter imperialist movements, anti-racist movements, or I don't know, I mean, Engin's probably going to say more, right? What kinds of organizations and alliances can emerge to deal with these new forms of backlash? I like the backlash notion, which
I don't.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Exactly the spirit.
Because
Yeah.
in the next question, my idea was to problematize this idea of backlash, because I don't think that this is a good way to approach what is going on. In a way, because this made us to feel panicked, because if backlash is something that is always here, so we have no future. You're always trapped in this cycle of being interrupted. So my idea is that maybe we could think in terms of different kinds of organization, but also in a different way to approach the problem. Maybe a different understanding of how history works in terms of patriarchy. Because of that, in that sense that I said, maybe we could think about patriarchy as something that is repetition, but something that does not have an idea of as always the same thing, and always this idea of not only the same strategy, but not only the same logic of always interrupting us. So my idea here is maybe to try to bring another ways to approach what these that we are calling backlash could be seen from other perspectives. But I will say for the next question.
Yeah.
Can I?
Would you still call patriarchy patriarchy?
Yes.
Yes.
I like the idea of
You still
yes,
work with that
yes,
concept. Okay, good.
actually, I think that's very important, especially for us in IR. We don't use that enough. So I think that is very important.
Okay.
And I have a question. I don't. Because I would like to ask for Jef if this idea of complexity could be seen as continuity. It is that continuity, because I'm thinking you said we don't have many concepts to help us with this complexity, but I'm of course here I have a bias, but I'm thinking in terms of some feminist concepts, like for example, the political category of body territory, body ether, Lage territory. So these are this idea or this concept are proposing something like, in terms of ontology, something that could help us think in a continuity. I don't know how to say that, but we have this is something that is a continuous. So we are not thinking in terms of lines and waters, but something that is like have this same materiality, something like that. So this is my question. If we could think complexity in terms of this continuity, something like that, in terms of ontology.
Can I answer that when I come back to the other one? I agree with you. I mean, I overstate the point that we don't have many instruments. I think there are quite a lot of instruments, but in the social sciences as well as in the sciences as well, from a bit, I've not read on science, but the social scientists writing about science. So I do think continuity is one, but it's an interesting one because it's an argument over how it's going back to the other one that we're going to get here about history, right? So there is an element about changing continuity, which is actually Yuri mentioned something about competition, but it doesn't produce exactly the same. So the one classical, you sing a song, but everyone who sings the song has a slightly different inflection, or maybe some massive, big inflection of it. So the song is the same, so there's continuity, but it's not the same at the same time. So that's a particular conception that I associate with how you do continuity and change together. And that's a way of, I would say, isn't valid by the people who think this do work in what I would call the, I mean, I had to find a name, right, for the present. So the present is complex to do that one. Because also, if you do continuity and continuity not as a repetition of the same, not as the copy
Yes.
of the model all the time, right, but as this move, then you have to think temporality in a different way, because you can't cut, you don't have the cutting off points anymore, because there is this ongoing flow. So how do you engage with that one? And I agree. I'll look up again the feminist literature on the body, but it's been a while since I've read that. But I mean, I know there are people working, and the complex systems sometimes have that too, right? I mean, it's not a simple thing about input output, but internally in the immanent element, they're not in status. They change, but they change imminently in what they have. So there is continuity, which is not a break that takes place. So I think that comes together with complexity, yes, for me. I think that's one of the instruments that thinks time gives temporality different.
In that sense, just would Engin say this is a point of inflection now? Is that what you're talking about? In the trajectory of social movements?
I don't think of a point of inflection, a point of counterinsurgency. State organized, corporate sponsored counterinsurgency against the social movements and their achievements in the last 50 years. It makes it perhaps an inflection point if at a higher level think about it. But I'm quite keen on it being not arbitrary, it being not accidental, and it being not haphazard. Counterinsurgency also comes from security studies and securitization of CIA techniques, now being used more political reasons against political opponents, both transversely across borders as well as in each of the nations. We see this in the US, we see this in Italy, we see this in Turkey, we see this in Russia. Similar techniques, counterinsurgency, and again, sponsored by states, but not necessarily as state actors, and funded and supported by corporations in a variety of forms. So this is the inflection point of the emergent politics of the moment, the present to me, as the question articulates, reference point. For me, the reference point, when I compare it with my experience of the last 40 years, up until very recently, perhaps naively and perhaps optimistically, the thinking was that anti-patriarchy, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, post-colonial, decolonial movements are on an upward trend, and we have to intensify it. Now with counterinsurgency, we find a moment, if you like, inflection point, where that upward curve is called into question. And the question, the political question emerges, how do you reorganize? How do you find new forms of institutionalization, deinstitutionalization, organization against this counterinsurgency? That, for me, is the political problem.
Okay, there's something for the next question.
Yeah, very quickly. I'll take that mentioning of the song, right? When you sing a song, second time, the song can be different and you are different in a way. The singing the song again changes oneself. In a way, this is the very definition of the modern redescription of the relation between boundary and relationality. So, I mean, you can only say that boundary is, as you said, in the past and complexity is in the present. If the definition of boundary is you here, one here, and the one there. But this is exactly the definition of boundary that has been challenged in modernity. You know, so my first point would be kind of an ontological analytical one. Complexity is inscribed in boundary practices, as boundary practice is inscribed in complexities. And the second point is a political question. I mean, drawing boundaries is not only a react to complexity. Drawing boundaries, if you think of homogenized subjectivities, drawing boundaries can be like surviving in a way. Drawing subjectivities, drawing boundaries, making protected spaces, making territorial spaces even, and making identity claims and so on. So I can't understand the distinction between complexity as being the present and I don't know what else boundary being the past, because even this distinction is the very product of modernity. Like modernity defines itself as complex in relation to traditional past. So I mean,
what can happen if you drop existing boundaries, borders, and limits?
Drop the existing, but why one would do that?
Well, drop it if the elements are complex, because it would open the question about whether we can have human associations. We can have. I'm not solving it. I'm stating a problem. That was what the question asked for. It's not about a solvable problem. It's an unsolvable thing that you actually invest in the present, for which you then open ways of thinking. So if you say, if you do, because it seems that the complexity comes back to the boundaries and the borders and the boundaries in the world, if you think relations without the borders and boundaries, and as an element of how it works, what kind of human associations are possible? How do we see them evolving? This does work. There is work around these elements. I think to inform associations happen. They're going on that social movements are not organized around the boundaries, but they work in a much, but they have to look across, right, in the relations. But they're more like an ecology. They experiment with the term of ecology, not in nature, but as a form of organization, right? Which is not defined by its limits and boundaries, but by the imminent kind of diversity in the relations take place. How would we think that? And I do think that, now this might be completely off, all of this, but politically it does change, because your politics is all about the borders and the boundary drawing in the end, right? Yeah, when you say the borders and the boundary, because we have to, no,
I'm not saying it's all about. I'm saying it's also about. It's very different.
Yeah, but what if we actually wouldn't do the borders and boundaries?
But this is a normative question?
No, it's an analytical question.
It's an analytical question.
Yes.
But I would say, what is the analytical purchase of focusing on complexity without thinking that relationalities and borders are intertwined? It's an ontological and political question.
It's an interference question for me analytically. So if you think complexity as that what relates without having to draw the distinction that borders, boundaries, and limits to, then what kind of associations are possible? And they do function. There is elements about this. For example, I mean, you know, some of the literature, even in genetics and epigenetics, is about within biology that the boundary between the biological body and the environment, the genes and the environment is much more fluid. So it's not a boundary between two systems. It's a flow that integrates, that works with one another. Which one tries to think? You can do similar things in social movements rather than position them around set identities. You know, how social movements are thinking. You know, the counterinsurgency is also one that splits. So you have actually to fracture the movements that nevertheless work in relation to one. And social movements, some of people, that's why I refer to ecology as the element. Now, whether it is a model or not, it's okay. But I would like to invest something. I would try to point on a limb, say, let's think a little bit about this. Complexity means that we do not reinscribe borders, boundaries, and limits as the tools to which we actually come to analyze social associations. Now, we can do the politics of them later on as well, because I don't want to take up all these times. I mean, there is an investment of a certain, which I had as well. One of the present is the reinvention and the reestablishment of the question of democratic politics and how that works. And there are notions of democratic politics that should be invested in the element of complexity, but that's another one. Maybe for later or whatever.
Okay, so João and Jef, when they told me about the structure of this roundtable, they told me that if there was a lot of discussions on the questions, we didn't need to proceed to the following one. And I know that Beth wants to intervene, so I'll allow that.
Should I?
Yes, you should.
Okay, okay. And so if I understood correctly, Paula, the first question was something around, tell something about the defining problems of the present. So I think
Reference points to which the present is problematized.
okay. So in a certain way, if I also understood Victor's question about where is the present, and I'm thinking here about this piece, if I remember correctly, that Chakrabarty once wrote about where is the now. And I'm also thinking about a specific chapter in his famous Provincializing Europe. I was wondering about what the present is doing in framing and conditioning the question posed. I was wondering how the present is somehow playing the role of what he would say is the universal middle term. And in that sense, normalizing and naturalizing something that should be provincialized, but by the way the question was framed, is non-provincializing the present in the first place. And I wonder how that creates another, at least, layer of problematization. So I was wondering about the critical role that the present is doing in the formulation of the question, thus the response.
Maybe we should listen to Paulina first.
Maybe this is a good segue.
Okay, so shall we proceed to the second question finally? So the second question is, how does critique relate to practices of periodization, defining past, present, and future? How do we engage with historical knowledge? How do we engage with what kind of historical knowledge to articulate the difference of the present? So shall we follow the same order?
Okay. Difficult question. So I want to stay close to the ideas I raised at the first question. And so for that, I want to reflect on how this feminist imaginary has used notions of repetition, reversal, and stagnation to think about historical change, especially when it comes to conservative insurgency. So most of these ideas, as I mentioned, are related with this so-called backlash literature. So this literature is actually quite mobilized by both the scholars and activism. So it's very common to see people reading. I forgot to.
Me too.
It's common to see people reading this power dynamics between progressive and conservative forces as this kind of mechanical sequence. So we have action and reaction. And so if we accept this perspective, feminism is often imagined as a force moving forward, but only to be pushed back by these conservative forces. So we are kind of caught in a cycle of achievements and losses. And for that reason, gender equality seems always as something, gender equality always seems like a premature celebration. We're almost there, but not yet. So you have to be patient. So I started to be a little bit suspicious about the framework some years ago, especially when I read an article by David Paternotte, in which he criticized this idea of progress that is underlining this backlash diagnosis. Very recently, I discovered Victoria Brown's. I don't know if anyone here knows her, but she also have a similar argument criticizing this historical logic behind the idea of backlash. So for these both authors, and I agree, this framework of the backlash presents not only empirical problems, so empirical weakness, because it seems to propose a too simplistic and too dualistic idea of power relations between conservative and progressive forces, but it also presents some political problems and ethical problems. For example, if we accept this narrative in which patriarchy seems always able to interrupt feminist contestation, then the future seems like an impossibility for us. But not just that, even the present seems to be coopted by those forces, since every time we try to make a claim of the present, we are thrown back in this kind of past. Of course, that past here does not mean historical past, but something like a restoration of a political idea of a moment without or before gender contestation, as we could construct this idea. So Paterno even argues that this idea of backlash this idea of past and present in the backlash framework can even lead us to self-censorship. In the sense, and he's right, I'm quoting him. If we consider that conservative actions come from progressive action, then one of the most reasonable strategies could imply abandoning some of our most controversial claims in the hope that this would decrease the backlash movement. So when I face this kind of reflection, one of the questions that comes to my mind is, how can we find a way back to the present? How can actually claim this present again? And for me, I'm saying feminist thoughts, critiques. And trying to answer that, I'm being inspired again by Victoria Brown's, when she said that for us to have a more productive engagement with the present, maybe we have to change our understandings of history, as I was saying, or maybe to use different models for thinking about historical change. So for her, we could, for example, when we think about backlash, we should not be seeing it as a step backwards, but more as an echo. Echo, is that okay? She is here using some Kierkegaarden and Nietzsche inspiration, put it that way. But she's saying that we have to live these events as an echo that does not repeat the past, but in a way promotes different encounter with this kind of past. So this, where I was here. So for example, when we think about the resurgency of evangelical movement in Brazil, especially among poor women, we should not see that as in terms of reversal or failure of the feminist movement, but more as this echo of these voices and ideas that were left behind in these linear narratives about Western feminism. So these echoes remind us that neither the past nor the future is closed. So they reopen the history, giving it a kind of multiple directions, acknowledges something that Victor said earlier in this class as a space-time lapse for us to, in a way, trying to find out different and possible directions for the future. So it's already 5 minutes, so that's it. Okay, that's the main point. Okay.
Thank you. I have to organize my thoughts now. Two things are lingering for me. One, Victor's impassioned advocacy of the international, importance of the international in terms of the current or the present transformations that we are experiencing, partly because the historical continuity, but partly because the ability to organize that way is already ensconced in the institutional organization of politics and power, and the importance of paying attention to that, that the international order and the idea of the international is part of the ways in which the present can be interrogated. And at the same time, I'm thinking about this notion of backlash. You're not liking backlash, but dealing with this issue of what happens when counterinsurgency as a challenge emerges, the effect of that on a movement. does it throw it back into a solid past, or does it throw it back into a dynamic difference, hence the issue of echo? When I was thinking about the issue of periodization, with respect to the question of the present, one of the things that has happened in the last, particularly 20 years, this is really a 21st century phenomenon. Up until the 21st century, the dominant periodization of the world was pretty much, world history was pretty much settled. That there was the emergence of civilizations about 8,000 years ago. And then these civilizations were personified, symbolized by the states. And with the development of states and empire, civilizations ebb and flow. And eventually in Europe, a new civilization based on these civilizations emerged. There was Dark Ages and then later Enlightenment. This is a modern periodization of the last 6,000 years or so, has remained for 200 years unchallenged. But in the last 20 years, or so 25 years in this century, we are finding that archaeologists, anthropologists, paleoanthropologists, biologists are rewriting first world history, and secondly, the planetary history. Frames of reference have tremendously expanded. Even, for example, someone like Foucault, who talks about the history of the present day, or his enlightenment, he often referred to the last 200 years, more or less in the late 18th century, 19th century. Now, archaeologists and anthropologists are talking about 500 years, 1,000 years, 5,000 years, and further expanded the complexity to billions of years, the formation of the earth and the human species, the emergence of human species and their movements in a different way. This, to me, the complexity of the present, our relationship to history has been upended in the last 20 years, where we can no longer simply think of history as being ensconced in the history of state, their self-definition. Three forms of evidence we can give. For example, James Scott, he writes this book just about 5 years ago, Against the Grain. And he enters into the fray on the origins of the state. And he says, to think of origins of the state as the origins of civilization is entirely a modern interpretation. And in fact, from the point of view of seeing like the state. If we write the history from the point of view of barbarians, it appears differently. So here he writes the last 11,000 years, Holocene, entirely differently. It doesn't appear as a progress. The emergence of cities is seen as the emergence of slavery, the capture of humans, domination of humans by humans, and domination of nature by humans. Agrarian revolution, the civilization, he rewrites it. It's not that positive. The domination of animals, domestication of animals, institutes a new relationship between human species and nature. We need to think all of this positive stuff from the point of view of barbarians. And he says, I'm using this term tongue in cheek. I mean those people who do not fit into the state narrative. This is bringing like entirely a new complexity of our relationship to history just in the last 11,000 years. And there are archaeologists and anthropologists are saying, wait a second, last 11,000 years is not even whole of the story. We have to push it to 50,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, when humans began moving out of Africa, made their movements, and along with them, carried also other species. This was not just human movement, but these were migrations on a big scale, including biological organisms migrating with them. As a result, the preconditions of those civilizations actually were prepared. And others are pushing, but 60,000 years ago, they moved up, but 100,000 years ago, humans also in Africa began organizing themselves differently, moving within Africa. And now genetic experience, genetic information is being used in this. And in social sciences, with the exception of perhaps James Scott, we are entirely blind to this development so far. 25 years of what is called now well-established deep history of not just humanity, but the planetary history. And this is when Dipesh Chakrabarty enters into the scene and says, you know, as a historian, I have been taught to remain within the bounds of world history, which starts with humans. And at most, you can push this about 5,000 years, the beginnings of cities. But this is actually very modern phenomenon, and it doesn't work. We need to write now, he says, geohistory. Geohistory expands history into these moments I mentioned. 500 years, 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, and further on. And we have to write, we have to begin to think in geohistorical terms, is his approach. For me, using Jeff's framework, I would say this is the complexity of the present. Our relationship to our own history of our own species, and its relation with other species and the planet Earth as a habitat has been upended. And we don't yet know what to do with this upended moment. This is another inflection point. How does this relate to counterinsurgency that I mentioned earlier? I do not know. But this is the moment in which we find ourselves, the complexity of relating to this history, particularly in social science and humanities, but in IR, we thought that history was at most about 200 years. The international system coming into being, 1648 and all that. Now, that seems like a second, nanosecond, in this deep history that we are given an account of. We need to get our head around this in IPS, in IR, but also in social sciences. And that, in a sense, is a call that Dipesh Chakrabarty made.
Thank you, Engin.
Yeah, so in relation to this question, I want to make 2 points. First, on periodization, and the second on the notion of the contemporary. So we all have in mind Max Weber's definition of the state in politics as vocation. I quote, we have to say that the state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Both in English and in the German version, successfully or is not in italics, but this is a very important part of the definition of the state, since it's integral to disputes around who gets authorized to legitimate this specific kind of human association. It is also the case that, recalling the previous question, Weber's approach would need to be supplemented by a consideration of the relation between the state and the international in modern politics and in the making of political communities, and the making and demaking of political communities. But here I allude to Weber's definition only to suggest that another dimension of the operation of the triple binding citizenship, state, and international could be defined as follows. What counts as a fully human is inseparable from successful claims to the monopoly of the legitimate use of periodization. That is to say, the struggle, and I think Pauline for it, but it's a kind of plagiarism. That is to say, struggles around the legitimation of practice of periodization still condition the demarcation of livable and unlivable lives, or how one is authorized to be subalternized or altogether eradicated. The most obvious example nowadays would be, of course, the genocide in Gaza, and how the October the 7th has become the most recent periodizing act legitimating a much longer history of multidimensional violence against the Palestinians. A periodizing act whose legitimacy is claimed in relation to another periodizing act, the one linked to Holocaust. But from a different and opposite perspective, the periodization linked to the Holocaust is also claimed to the establishment of a relation between the latter and the Gaza Strip as the current modified version of concentration camps. And in a yet different take on these periodizing acts, if one recalls Césaire, Fanon, even Hannah Arendt and Foucault, all of which in different ways established another series of periodizations when they pointed out how the Jewish genocide was inseparable from the history of colonial violence. And in all these different positions, a series of periodizing acts is set in order to legitimize certain political communities at the expense of others. I'm not doing this other example, but yet another example would be the reinterpretation of Black Brazilian movements and intellectuals, the reinterpretation they gave to Palmares, and to the phenomenon of historical quilombos more broadly, as well as to the 1888 formal abolition, resituating the connection of these two periods in relation to a longer national but also Atlantic history of anti-Black racism. Related to that, one can recall Abdias Nascimento's testimony, published in a book whose purpose was the collection of memories of people exiled by the 1964 civil military dictatorship in Brazil. Abdias Nascimento said, I quote, "My exile is of a different nature. It did not begin in 1974 or 1968, nor in any of the 62 years of my life. Today, more than ever, I understand I was born in exile to parents who were also born in exile, descendants of Africans forcibly brought to the Americas," end of quote. So the periodizing acts linked to 1964 civil military coup or to the 1968 Institutional Act number 5, both very, very important for human rights and democratic struggles in Brazil, are resituated by Abdias Nascimento within a different history marked by a periodizing act linked to the Atlantic slave trade. So these different but not unconnected examples, I would say, if we think of the importance of an internationality of struggles that I mentioned before, of what Angela Davis once named the intersectionality of struggles, these examples express the importance of periodization, not only to political struggles, but also to contemporary theorization. So this leads me to the second point, but I won't have time to do paragraph. So,
Some of my times.
This leads to my second point. I would suggest that instead of thinking about the difference of the present, we could recuperate a certain understanding of the notion of the contemporary. I draw inspiration here from the well-known essay, What is the Contemporary?, written by Giorgio Agamben. We can forget what Giorgio Agamben said during the pandemic, okay? This essay. And we find at least two dimensions in Agamben's considerations. The first one speaks about those who are truly contemporary, I quote, who neither perfectly coincide with their time nor adjust themselves to its demands, end of quote. This makes these people, the contemporary, more capable of perceiving and grasping their own time, precisely because they perceive it as broken, situate themselves in its fracture. This way, I quote Agamben again, the contemporary is the person who firmly holds their gaze on their own time so as to perceive not its light, but rather its darkness. The latter, however, darkness being separate from the form of its light. Instead of thinking the contemporary as a person that Agamben problematically identifies as a rare and courageous person, it's problematic, right? But I would suggest we could think of this notion of the contemporary as a mode of thinking, which is also, of course, a mode of being and acting. A contemporary or critical thinking is that which inhabits but never totally coincides with the present. Actually, drawing inspiration from another dimension of Agamben's definition, one could say that the contemporary is a mode of thinking pointing to an encounter between times and generations, or rather, an encounter between space-times and worlds in the plural, that compose the brokenness and fractures of the so-called present. This way, this mode of thinking, the contemporary, can transform the space-time it inhabits, but not entirely coincide with, precisely to the extent that it puts this space-time in relation to other space-times and worlds. The contemporary, in this sense, is also a mode of critical thinking one that is attentive to the encounter of multiple space-times and worlds in order to multiply the possible confrontations and alliances in face of the brokenness of the now. That's it. I mean, I'm not good at anything.
I mean, I'm not going to make a similar kind of declaration. I'll try to get more, but the problem is, I hope you can hear me at the end, because when I start in a more conversational style, my voice goes down and you cannot hear me at the end anymore. So that's why I shout sometimes. But if you can hear me, it's fine. If not, then just go raise your hand, right? I just want to pick up two things. I don't have well, I have things to say. I was going to say I have not so much to say, but that's not true. To get a little bit better, the element about the role of the present, say the political role. I was going to think, maybe one of the roles of the question of the present, as it's formulated, is to make us reflect about history. But history, for me, is most interestingly, it's not time and temporality, it's a form of knowledge. It's how the past is brought into the present. And that, I think, is interesting. And then you can start seeing, and then it becomes political, social, cultural, whatever it is, you know, and it becomes an element of contestation, or in my terminology, I prefer interferences in what is going on. And here I think we have, I'll come back to Lara about the echoes, which I'll like to, but the way I read what Engin is talking about the long or deep history, for example, rather than doing this as a periodization, which is another form of historical knowledge. What's interesting about this deep history is also, it has a lot to do with the methodology of how the past is brought into the present. So there is a more archaeological, genetic kind of process going on. One of the critiques of deep history is how they position themselves as a different form of knowledge. So it's not about the ontology of the past, it's how the past is brought into the present. Is that we are obsessed with civilization. And the reason why we're obsessed with civilization is that for a long time, most of history is not written through archaeology, but through textual resources that we have. Hence, you need who produces text, administrative centers produce text. So we have a lot of traces of administrative centers, which then become the cities and the civilization, which is, I think, part of James Scott's argument as well. So, but interestingly, the present raised the question about history as a form of knowledge, which is in this element about the methodology of how it comes in and how you can make interferences in debates and critical points, whether it's like a planetary or whether it's an obsession with civilization, for example, by bringing this form of knowledge in. But it's not anything, right? There is a tradition, and history has long traditions of, you know, through archaeology. I don't know the tensions. I'm sure there have been tensions between the cultural histories and the archaeologists in the past and the present. So that's an element. I think the role of the present maybe is to do that. You know, we can talk about the future in a similar way. But for me, what's important is that history is always a question about knowledge. It's not about the past. It's how, and that brings me to the second point, which is, I think this I like the forward and backward move. I have another thing why I got started thinking about this, which had nothing to do with struggles or so on immediately. It was very recently, well, in the last 7-8 years, there was a re-emergence in the small European world. I mean, it's not all of this world around the UK and a bit in Europe, in the security sector, were very classical geopolitical thought about great powers, land capture. Of course, it comes on the back of the war in the Ukraine, right? Came reasserted, but it was already there before. Now, this you can see in international relations as a form of knowledge. It's like Waltz, I think it was Waltz who said, right? Sooner or later, we'll be back. That was in the 1990s. So we're all gone, the old Cold War is gone, but sooner or later, we'll back to the anarchical system where the states and the great powers will come, because we always get back to that. So 30 years of exceptionality. I think it was Walt, maybe it was someone else who said, maybe it was Walt, I can't remember. But no, I don't want to mention Mersheimer. So and that reassigned me to Walt, and I reassigned Walt. I think Walt is more interesting, so you might want to read him rather than Mersheimer if you want to be a realist. But anyway, that's beside the point. So there is an element about as well, what is that? And then you got into policy, the return of the Cold War. which comes with a massive militarization that's happening. And so it's as if the past is back. There's a backlash against all these 30 years, and the past is back. But if we understand the present, the contemporary, as actually not being a circle where you return and then it comes exactly the same, comes back, then it opens up a more interesting way to look at what is happening. It's not a reproduction. You have to start looking. What is going on in the claims of geopolitics, and what other elements are actually structuring? For example, what's happening at the Finnish border, well, and how this elements about the reinvestment of territoriality, militarization, what is it doing? Who is opposing? Who is alternative? How is this shaping up? Is it shaping up exactly in the same way, and so on? So it then opens up a question that there is an echo, yes, but the echo is not necessarily the return of the past. And so I work not with echoes, but I like these terms. I work with the category of the untimely. So when there is an untimeliness to things, which is what, you know, the past is not that what you return. It's always in, and that's also a role of the present. It's always in the present that the issues are being, and that concern us. Right? The past is brought into the present order. And the same we can do about the future. I don't want to talk about the future. And the contemporary, we refer to Agamben, but the contemporary, as it was developed by a lab of anthropologists, which Rabinov had, they also had the anthropology of the contemporary, which was exactly this element where you actually try to understand that you try to move from radical breaks or this eternal return of things to past and present are intertwined. So you always study the contemporary, and it comes with different methods of research, different ways of interviewing, different ways of structuring your knowledge. And that, I think, is quite interesting to work around the question of how to approach the question of the present and what's invested in it. If it becomes echoes, contemporary or untimeliness.
Just let me ask you something. You finished at 6 or half 6?
6, but
No.
6-ish.
Yeah, just to know if I should just try to wrap it up as the audience for their final questions or comments. If we can stay. Well,
if they don't kick us out,
yeah, okay, so continue.
Let's keep staying.
Yeah, let's keep staying. Okay, do we have any questions, comments from the audience? Yes, we do. Let me just check if there's somebody else. I'm joking that. No.
And it's not a queer. Sorry, I was not prepared to say my question on this right now. But yeah, thank you so much for this. My name is Anderson. I'm from the Department of Law here, but I have a graduation in international relations, and now I'm researching in the law academia reparations and how the international system deals with reparation. I've been looking for the role of the social movements here in Brazil that is very strong in the international human rights system. And I just wanted to draw a thought of Patricia Hill-Collins, that is what lost, what lose in the translation between when the social movement went to the academia, to the white academia, how the agenda of the social movement lose the conceptualization of autonomy and autonomy for all, no? And here in Brazil, we've been seeing that social movements it's getting, for example, in the 80s, the social movement gets a lot of influence in the constitutional process of Brazil. And then funds, international funds like Open Society, like Ford Foundation, started to grant money for those social movements. That is most Black women's movement. And those Black women's movements started to get institutionalized, you know. And in this institutionalization, what is lost in translation? what we missed from the original agenda of social movement, that nowadays we can see that those incorporated institutionalized movements lost from the original agenda and in the road to seek for racial justice, for more public policies, you know. So for me, it's very clear that the institutionalization of those movements has a big impact in the liberal order. In the same time, because we have now movements like Lage, like Viola in international human rights system, but in what they think about racial justice, about what they think about human rights, for example, and this is very important. But these movements forget about things about decolonization, or to give voice for small social movements that is acting on the field against racism, against feminicide, and yeah, it's just some thoughts about liberalization process and social movements that we would like to raise.
Se uma outra pessoa quiser falar, fique à vontade. Não quero.
Your turn.
Okay. So maybe, I mean, what's your name? Emerson. So I think if I understood your point, Emerson, I use, influenced by you, I will pose my question in the following way. I was wondering how both questions so far and your responses would relate with what I would metaphorically, but not only metaphorically, refer to the politics of translation. And I'm here thinking about, again, Chakrabarty. So if inspired by Spivak, I'm thinking about language as a kind of a social unconscious that in many ways condition the possibility both of knowledge and critique. And if we take the problem of the international and rethinking a suggestion from Jenny Adkins and Maya Zeifels many years ago about generalizing the international, but here I would say imploding the national, as some fourth world approaches to international law have been suggesting. And that generalization and implosion leads us towards the more than 7,000 languages still existing in the present world, once there were more than 8,000. And Engin, I completely agree with the new trajectories that you were talking about, and also with what Jef was telling about the present. But I was wondering if one takes seriously what, if I understood correctly, both Chakrabarty and Spivak were telling about a certain macro-political that would not disconsider these more than 7,000 languages existing in the world. I was wondering the politics of language and translation that plays into this politics of history that we are talking about. If, and just to go to the specific points, one considers, for instance, Kathleen Davis' own terms in her book, Sovereignty and Periodization, that, at least in a certain passage, if I recall it correctly, is telling that one of the problems between the relationship between sovereignty and periodization is precisely the globalization and normalization of non-provincialized political forms, such as, for instance, the many terms and forms that we allude to by talking about future, present, past, territory, and so on and so forth. So I was just wondering how one deals with the problem of this broader politics of language and translation in relation to the problems that you're trying to respond.
Maybe you can answer that and then we have a final round.
Well, it's. I'll try. It's really a difficult question, but let me just frame the question as a question of knowledge and language and translation as part of it. I think this being at a moment of appended by our own history is also associated with the emergence of new agencies, new voices being restored or rejuvenated or installed into history. So we are hearing like James Scott says barbarian as a general category, but that is a figure that represents all the voices and languages that have been written out of history. So if we are at an inflection point where we're just about to make this shift from having a homogeneous and linear understanding of ourselves as moderns in human history, having gone through various phases of civilization and ended teleologically as the endpoint of modernity. If you're appending that and all the periodization and forms of knowledge that come with that, historical knowledges, then the voices that are going to be restored agency are 7,000 plus, 7,000 languages, but also thousands of agencies, forms of living, forms of being, forms of doing things, forms of relating to things, practices being left out of history and homogenized by the international system, modern system. If we are in that moment, at one point I shudder to think about its complexity and how recent this is, if we're talking about only the last 25 years. But at the same time, with this complexity, I do feel, along with others, a certain liberation, a certain emancipation, that this is actually an instance of how we emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, of thinking through our history in a particular way. And it's open, and with all the fear that it might generate, in this moment of openness and the immense challenge, number of principles are emerging of how not to do history, how not to produce historical knowledge. And in a way, the debate on deep history, participation of James Scott and Dipesh Chakrabarty and others, Spivak, I think indicating that there are those of us who are willing to embrace this challenge and to think again how restoring voice to the voiceless is going to be such a difficult process. And yet, in the same moment of emancipation, and this is, I keep coming back to this notion that really I find it challenging. In this moment of inflection, where it's a moment of emancipation, we are seeing this happening. We have also counterinsurgency against it. Well organized, well dispersed, well funded, well supported by both the international system and the national system that makes it part, and with the corporate organization of it. So AI is an example of that. Here we are, just a digression on AI in terms of forms of knowledge and the kind of symbolic violence it's producing. So at this moment of emancipation, that we are facing restoring 7,000 voices as a figure of, as an emancipated history, AI is actually summarizing, framing the modernist modernist forms of language and knowledge and regurgitating back to us as the new form of knowledge, right? So at the moment of emancipation, where there are 7,000 plus voices of agency need to be exploded and introduced in history, we are producing from the modern forms of knowledge in the last 500 years, a summarized version of it passing itself as the dominant knowledge underwritten by the corporate tech. This is an immense challenge. And because what AI is doing now, it's reinscribing the current forms of knowledge that we have, once again, this time in an anonymized ways, giving huge legitimacy to it. University papers are being written with it. University slides, slide presentations are made with it. New forms of presentations are really, I'm quoting, and so on. This is an immense complexity, right? A new legitimacy is being done with AI that is making even more difficult the emancipation of knowledges now. That's where we are.
I think Emerson's question was to you as well, right? For everybody.
But Emerson's, quickly, if I can respond to Emerson, is just the concluding part of my remarks. Actually related, I had your question in mind. Your question is dear to me. What is lost when social movements are integrated into state and corporate machinery? University is one. What is lost in translation of the all emancipatory capacities and knowledges and questions that they have been able to raise and how they're incorporated into the machine? What is lost in there? A lot. A lot in the sense that the AI example gives. What is lost with emancipated knowledges now being incorporated into AI training systems, summarized, trained, anesthetized, simplified, and regurgitated back to masses as the truth and as a truth-telling mechanism. A lot is being lost. So then what is to be done is the question, the next question that you might ask. A lot is lost with its incorporation, but how it is to be resisted, how it is to be subverted, how it is to be taken into different directions within AI and outside AI. I don't have an answer. How can it be done within AI? I know some of the complexity through which it summarizes its contents and frames knowledge, but how that can be subverted, I do not know. That is the next political battle, or one of the next political battles.
Can I quickly? I agree and I don't agree. There is an element, there's a particular framing of the translation and lost in translation. It's a negative position. It's as if there was an authentic kind of element that you want to realize principally. But you can also ask, I can invert it, what's gained when the social movements enter a different field, a different set of institutions, which is a different way of looking at the elements about what's going on. Because when you always say, if you use the metaphor or the analytical scheme to translate, certain readings are if you don't lose, you translate. So something becomes understandable in a different way. It's not exactly the same, but it wouldn't exist for me if you don't translate the Portuguese to it. Right? There is a language going on, but I have no idea what's going on. Now, you translate in English, maybe something gets changed, but at least I can engage with you, for example, through the language. So rather than say what's lost in translation, you could say what's gained in translation. And the reason why I'm saying that is that there are other ways other than the language, which I'll come back to, if not look at translation, but use a much more classical sociological element about the positioning and the multi-positioning that happens. So to get away from this old idea that co-optation is a problem because you become corrupted. Fine, then you stay on the street. But you know, there are institutions, there are legal institutions and so on. So how are you gonna actually make a difference in the institutions, for example? Now, there is a sociological element that fields function differently. So society is not a homogeneity where you move against. You have different, so you have multi-positioning. Now, if you operate in a particular environment, you cannot operate on the same terms as in another field. You have to operate in the terms of the field. If I'm in law, I'll have to speak law. And if I try to subvert it, I have to do it through law. I cannot do it by saying, oh, I don't believe in law. I'm sure I'll be put out of the courts or whatever legal discussion without being. So there is an element about not translation of what's lost. I would go for gaining what's gained by the translation, but also as a necessity of manipulation if we think in terms of this. And I wouldn't use I would use multi-positioning in the different fields of positioning in different games that are going on in different elements around issues. And that's what out with Chakrabarti. For example, a question with Chakrabarti, if it's about translation, what he does is he translates a geological anthropocenic kind of knowledge, which is a highly scientific form of knowledge that is the basis that he then tries to relate into humanities. So there is a moment of translation. But if you just do translation, it seems that the problem is what is not questioned in that is that we take the geological position as the starting point and the given from which we have to translate the problems that humanities are facing. Now, there's a legitimate reason. There's not a critique of the book, but there is something with translation that actually also hides things. Is that there is a basis which is translated, and that needs to be questioned too, right? If we do critical kind of engagement with the work. And therefore, I am not always in favor with translation, not in that way. Translation in the more, I think I came across that first in Michel Serres, where it's, you move from one, for example, from mathematics to social sciences. He does it with disciplines, right? And it's not about getting lost. It's about, this is communication that happens. And of course, things are different, but that's how it works. And so it's not about lost. There's no authentic kind of starting point, right?
Yeah, just one point, can I? Yes, I get the both points here, but at the same time, I think, Jef, that for academia, it's really a gain, but in the same time, it's a loss for the society when we observe this movement institutionalize it as a loss of massive power, because when those movements was a massive power, they get a lot of political wins, such as the constitutional, the affirmative actions for people of consent. But nowadays, we are losing these translations because there is a behavior or a pattern of the social movements to get into the government, for example, to get financed by liberal institutions, yes, or to get into the academy.
But we cannot, then of course, you still assume there was one movement that now has lost its way. But I'm sure there are other kind of struggles going on, things popping up and doing things still in the sphere of social movements as well. So it's still the element about we have an authentic movement that becomes co-opted and now we've lost it. Well, actually, they also made a massive difference from what I hear and what they did. So I find it awkward to think this co-optation and this loss all the time, as if, it's really bad because as if then we get indeed backlash is a return to destruction of what was present before and now it's gone and disappearing, which is not what you're saying, because you say there have been constitutional change and so on, which might have made it possible for them to enter the institutions, for example, right? So
I think Lara and Julho to
I think I would like to ask you something. What do you understand by loss? Like, is it in the sense of suffering or no existence? Or like, where does it go when we lose something? Where does it go? Like, because I'm asking this because my idea, which, for example, when I think about these critics about the backlash, backlash for saying feminist is moving thing, right? But what I try to imagine here is that these forgotten things or these that were not in this translation, it keeps existing. Maybe it actually can sometimes come back as an echo, as you're saying. But it is important, it is possible for us to think a different type of existence that does not require a discourse, for example. Because I don't know if you agree with me, but please, could you give me an example of something that was lost in this translation? Just an example.
For me, it's for example, we lost when in the international human rights system, we have a lot of organizations, corporative social organizations that says on behalf of social movements, local social movements, and meanwhile those social movements is not there to put issues like race or feminism into question and theorizing human rights in the international organization.
Yeah, but in that case, will it be a problem of representation?
Yeah.
Rather than translation?
Yeah, but it's I think there is a connection of that is neoliberal, connection of education.
Yes.
You know, you just can say, you just can classify, theorize human rights when you are an organization with OHCHR or ECOTOC.
Yes, I agree. I'm just saying that because, like, when we think about, I'm thinking the idea we have about climate change, for example, or how we understand this idea of development through, when we try to translate, for example, some indigenous way of life in ideas of sustainability. So we have something that got lost here. But even if we are not able, or the movement are not able to say that, there is a the material resistance that exists outside the discourse, keep existing, keep in a way, I don't know, if tension this discourse, maybe not in symbolic ways, but maybe in other dimension of existence. For example, not only when we think about material precarity, but also emotions and other types of experience. So experiences, or the way out for a movement, is not only to be translated in terms of language. There's other ways of these encounters to happen. I don't know if I'm clear here.
It's still on Emerson's question. I understand the idea of institutionalization, but I think that there is a normative training that maybe is driving this argument you are sharing with us, and an analytical training that would be maybe advantages. So the normative training, I recall in the late 80s, I think early 90s, Stuart Hall has said that one of the challenges to the left, he said, was to abandon the framing that it's either cooptation or revolution, cooptation or revolution. And the contemporary configurations, according to him, would require from us a different normative framing to analyze contemporary processes. So if institutionalization is reduced to a loss of some energy that was somewhere there, this can make us see these changes as either a cooptation or a revolution, when I think the processes are more heterogeneous than these two possible normative frames. The second one would be to understand institutionalization, for instance, when we think of analytical framings, such as the ones linked to Black capitalism, not racial capitalism, but Black capitalism. There is to say a certain reconfiguration of race and class in contemporary capitalism, providing some kind of upward mobility, which was, by the way, Abdias Nascimento's problem with some Black individuals that got to be successful, abandoning the collective fight, as he put. So the upward social mobility. In Black capitalism, so institutionalization in relation to Black capitalism, I think gains more complexity than either a strategic failure or a conduct that is not authentic or revolutionary enough. And finally, the third point would be affirmative policies and constitutional gains were in a way strategic gains that came from certain interaction with institutions. And it's true that in Brazil, for instance, the affirmative politics have gained this purchase at the expense of some different claims of reparations. But then if you see in France, claims for reparations sometimes are integrated in the state as reparations of museum artifacts, and then maybe works with Macron. I'm not against, maybe, I don't know, but anyway, they work this and they reduce reparations to this kind of different ways of conceiving museums. So my point would be that institutionalization can be a strategic path and can be a problem. But if you understand it in relation to some notions such as Black capitalism, I think it gets more complex than either a loss or an authentic, more radical struggle that stayed in the past. In Portuguese, this would make sense.
In English.
After 6. Shall we? Okay. So I'd like to thank our panelists and the audience. I think this discussion has been productive. We never got to question number 3. So if you're curious, I'll just say, yeah. Do critical engagements with the present necessitate reconfigurations of historical agency?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's okay, thank you. Shall we?
Let me continue with the show or something.